Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So first of all, Happy New Year. I know we're halfway through January now and it's a little bit late to be saying that, but since this is the first time I'm speaking to you, I want to say Happy New Year. I hope you had an amazing Christmas. We had a really lovely relaxed one. It was exactly what we needed, and now we're ready to kickstart the new year. So what do I want to start with? Okay, so video and scheduling wise, as I said sort of back end of last year, I was struggling a little bit. I wanted to work out a new schedule where I could put out quality content that I'm like really happy with, and to do that we're going down to videos once a fortnight. We're going to have one big project video a month, which I'm going to make a real effort to make sure that the projects are all very different. It's not like pair of trousers after pair of trousers. So yeah, I've got a range of projects that I want to be doing, some bigger, some smaller, but yeah, hopefully some really exciting ones, lots of different techniques. And then the other video a month will be a range of things from tutorial based or looking at like costing and stuff, but everything's going to be sewing related. So that's my plan. I hope that works for you, and let me know if there's anything that you want to see from me down in the comments below, as I'd love to hear your ideas. And today we're going to start with a tutorial. So I thought, since it's the new year, we might be getting new people starting to sew or who haven't sewn for a long time and feeling inspired to sew again. So I wanted to go back to basics a little bit and look at the handling of seams. So it's easy enough to follow a pattern because they go through instructions, and if you've not sewn for a while, you can work it out, a few Google searches here and there to work out what terminology means. It's not too bad to follow a pattern, but patterns don't always handle the fraying of seams. And if you don't have an overlocker, this can sometimes be a little bit hard to work out what you should do where. So I wanted this video to be a reminder of how we can do some different seams, where we'd use them, and yeah, just how we can make our makes last that little bit longer and be that little bit higher quality, because that all lies into sustainability and making your clothes last. And if you're making something with a really beautiful fabric that fits you perfectly, you don't want it to be looking a bit tatty after a few washes. You want it to last as long as it possibly can. So that's what we're going to do today, and hopefully for those of you who know all of these, it will be a nice refresher. And for anybody new here, hi, I'm Hannah, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so we're gonna start with what I'd call a run and fell seam. So I've got two pieces of fabric. I've made sure they're a really high contrast so you can see properly what I'm doing. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a normal plain seam. So I'm going to put the wrong sides of the fabric together, and I'm going to stitch down the edge with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. If you were drawing a pattern and doing this seam, you could make a allowance for a 2 centimeter seam allowance, but I want to show you how you can incorporate it into normal pattern making, like pattern sewing. So if you were following a pattern, it would normally have a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to show you how you can do this with that without having to alter anything pattern wise. Okay, so this is what's called a normal plain seam. So we'll start with that. And it's generally what patterns would ask for if you were just following the instructions. You'd obviously do right sides together. This is, so you've got your seam allowance on the wrong side of this fabric currently, but that's because we're going to turn this into a run and fell seam. But if you were doing a plain seam, you'd probably have overlocked your edges first to make sure they don't fray. You do right sides together and then the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and iron it flat. For the run and fell seam, what we're going to do is we're going to trim down one side of the fabric. So we're going to trim down the seam allowance of this green piece here. And I'm going to trim that to about a 0.5 centimetre. Generally do it by eye, but sort of like as close as you can, but making sure there's that little bit so you're not going to fray beyond the seam. Okay, so here you can see that's all trimmed down and we've left this orange bit nice and long. We're then going to iron it down like flat like this, and we're going to iron the orange piece over the green piece. So we're going to iron that flat so you've got this line of stitching showing down here. The next thing we're going to do, and this is the part which stops it from fraying and basically conceals your raw edges. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold this orange piece underneath our trimmed seam allowance of the green. So we're going to fold that under there, and then we're going to fold that down flat onto the green fabric, and that's what we're going to stitch in place. So I'm going to iron that and then pin it, and we'll stitch it. So when I'm stitching this, I want to do it as close to this folded edge as I can. And I always judge that by peeping through the little hole in your foot, and you can sort of see where your needle's going to line up. So that's lining up really nicely, a couple of mil in, and I'm going to do my best to keep that as neat as possible as I go along. Okay, so that is the finished run and fell seam. So the next seam we're going to do is the French seam. And to start this off, we go wrong sides together again. And then down the edge that we're going to stitch, we are going to stitch a 0.5 centimetre or half a centimetre seam allowance down there. You can mark this on if you're a little bit worried about how much of a seam allowance you need to leave. I tend to do this by eye and just peep through my foot to find out sort of how far in I'm stitching. Okay, so that has got a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance. What we're going to do is we're going to turn it over and iron this flat, and then we're going to iron it so that it folds over. You've got right sides together, you've got the seam allowance on the inside, and you're going to iron that so it sits nice and flat. When you iron them one on top of the other, there's a technique where you just like roll the seam, and it means that you've not got any excess fabric trapped in there, and you're getting right where the stitching line is at the very edge. Once you've ironed that and you're happy, you can pin along this edge, and we're going to stitch that now at a 1 centimetre seam allowance. When stitching a 1 centimetre seam allowance, there is a guide on the machine, which hopefully yours has too. If not, it's very, very close to lining up with the edge of the machine foot. So that is the French seam done. It leaves you with what looks like a plain seam on the outside. There's no fuss, there's no added details, unlike on the run and fell seam. And then on the back, you have your seam allowance with the raw edges tucked inside, so that sits nice and flat and neat, and it will prevent any fraying. The next seam I'm going to show you is for when you can't do a French seam or a run and fell seam. So this might be on garments where you don't know the actual fit, and you know that you want to take the seams in more, which can be much more difficult on a French seam or a run and fell seam. It might also be if you've, say, made a blouse and you've French seamed everything, but you get to the armholes and you're like, what do I do? with these. This is what I do in those situations. It's also the technique that's used on a lot of vintage gowns. So when I've followed 1950s patterns, this is how they've recommended doing your raw edges and your seams. So we're going to start off with a normal plain seam, so right sides together, and then we're doing a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance down the edge. So here we have got a bog standard plain seam. When you open it up, it looks like that, exactly the same as the French seam does when you open it up. And we're going to look at this raw edge. So what I'm going to use for this is I'm going to use some binding. So I'd massively recommend, if you're going to bind something, that you buy pre-made binding, because it is a pain to make. Binding is cut on the bias of the fabric. So in order to make your own, it's absolutely possible, but you use quite a lot of fabric because everything's cut on the diagonal. But you can cut it on the diagonal, you can join the pieces together, or you can buy it in, like, as you would ribbon in reels, and it comes in, well, it makes everything a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this pre-made binding, and I'm going to line it up with the seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin it, and down this crease I'm then going to stitch it. This will be about in the same place as my seam allowance. You need to make sure it's in the same place or within it. So I might actually move this out a little bit just to be sure that I'm not bringing in the fabric any more than I want to be. So now what we've got is we've got this binding attached on one side, like that. What we're going to do next is we're going to keep these two pieces of fabric folded together with the seam allowance pointing out the top, and what we're going to do is flip it over, and we're going to fold this binding over the raw edges and pin it in place like that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to neatly top stitch along this edge and just secure the binding in place. So after a quick little iron, that is the bound seam done. And that is how it looks on the back. So all the raw edges are encapsulated in the binding. If you were doing something and halfway up the seam it had to split and lie open, say it's a back seam of a dress and you've got a zip in it, what I'd do is I'd bind the two separate seam allowance pieces and iron them flat like that. Sometimes it's needed on different seams. It depends what you're making and how it goes as you get higher up the garment, but otherwise sometimes you can just stick it all in one and it's a little bit quicker. I know these methods all take that little bit of extra time, but they make a big difference to the sews and how long they'll last and the quality of the final garment, so they're really, really worth doing. So that is all for this one. Thank you very much for joining me. If you found this helpful, please give it a like, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one for my first make of the year. So I'll see you soon, bye.